Really feels like the end of society out here, doesn't it? We're stretched too far militarily. There's incredible division. We're all in debt. If we want to save society, we have to return to what society was built on, which is Christianity.
I think that we are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer, but there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian. And so, I love hymns and Christmas carols, and I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. I feel that we are a Christian country in that sense. It's true that statistically the number of people who actually believe in Christianity is going down, and I'm happy with that. But I would not be happy if, for example, we lost all our cathedrals and our beautiful parish churches. So I count myself a cultural Christian. I think it would matter if we substituted any alternative religion. That would be truly dreadful.
English scholar Thomas Holland wrote a groundbreaking historical treatise called Dominion, Making of the Western Mind. This much lauded work tells the story of how Christianity changed the moral landscape of the world, and as such impacted Western culture in ways we cannot and do not truly understand. We take Christianity's moral foundation in our society so for granted that the social justice warriors of our world are more often than not atheists, or at the very least into some new age bullshit. And as such, they can't see the forest for the trees. They are protesting for equality, for human rights, to help the poor, to help the sick, to end the wars. Where do they think that these moral platitudes came from? It wasn't from the Romans or the Greeks, both of which were incredibly violent and ruthless. You think they cared about the poor or civilian casualties in war? That is a laughable notion. You say you hate fascists? Where do you think that term came from? The fasci was the name of the weapon the Romans used for keeping the masses in line. One is only as good, and I mean good in the purest sense of the word, as what they worship or venerate. The Greek and Roman pantheon of gods were vicious, perverted, violent, and capricious in every respect. Zeus was a rapist, Apollo a stalker, Dionysus a drunken degenerate. The list goes on and on. There is nothing to admire about any of them, let alone worship. But these were the Greek and Roman symbols of power, their idealistic leaders. What is more, none of these gods ever really existed, as far as we can tell. In other words, they are all mythical. I can hear all the pagans and atheists now. Your God doesn't exist either. And looking at the Old Testament, your God was every bit as ruthless. Oh, I respond, my God did and does exist. What year is it, I ask? You answer, 2024. Well, where do you think that number came from? It's based on the historical birth of my God. It is based on when my God walked the earth in the flesh of man. The year is just another thing we take for granted, not realizing the true, unseen influence the Christian worldview has had on our world. And as for my God being ruthless, that is an illiterate position, because anyone who can read the Bible can understand that God's actions are always just and merciful. As I said, the pagan gods are the capricious ones. There is no rhyme or reason to their actions. My God, on the other hand, has made it clear from the very beginning there are certain things he wants us to do and certain things he doesn't want us to do. He has made his commands abundantly clear. He said to Adam and Eve, "Do not eat from that tree," and they understood exactly what he meant. Nonetheless, they deliberately disobeyed him, and as such, they were punished. For all the New Age Buddhist meditating yogis out there, you may understand this concept as karma. Or for my agnostic science friends, it's like saying, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. You do good and good things will happen. You do bad and bad things will happen. So then the question emerges, how do we know what is good and what is bad? The answer to this is quite simple. It's whatever God decides. Statists, the rational materialists who have replaced religion with the state, will tell you that it is the government that decides what is good and bad. Me and half the country think abortion is bad, but the state deems it okay. The state used to say that slavery was okay. Should we really be deriving our moral compass from the state? No, of course not. Every one of us, we all know right from wrong. Some of my psychologist friends might say, what about psychopaths? They don't know the difference between right and wrong. Oh, but they do. A psychopath can tell you every time, real or imagined, when they've been wronged. One can only know if he's been wronged if he has some conception of what is right or fair. So how do we know what is right and wrong, what is good and bad? God tells us. He wrote it in a book for us to read, and he put it within our souls for us to feel. We feel guilt and shame as a moral warning whenever we do something that we shouldn't. We all have a conscience, but sometimes, like our parents Adam and Eve, we deliberately disobey God. We tell ourselves we can't help it or that it's not that bad. This disobedience then leads to hardship, and then hardship brings us to a fork in the road. We can either choose to return to God's path, or we can continue to try to go our own way. Because of God's infinite mercy, there is always a turn-off point from our own path where we can return to him. Jesus' parable of the prodigal son tells us this. I would challenge all the rational materialists out there, if you really are dedicated to the scientific method, then try this experiment. For 1 week, follow God's path instead of your own, and watch the results. The abundance of peace and serenity you will begin to feel will be immeasurable. And because of its immeasurability, the limitations of science and our human understanding will always fall short of calculating God. He exists outside of time, space, and matter. The Bible begins, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." In the beginning, time, God created heaven, space, and the earth, matter. He exists outside of human limitations, and as such, he is always outside of our physical and mental reach. That's what makes him, coming down to earth as Jesus Christ, so incredibly amazing. It is such a humbling and loving consideration of our human insufficiency. He gave us an opportunity to understand him on our terms, where we could record our findings and measure our results. Hence the year 2024, hence the Bible. We have been calculating God's existence in our world the best we can, as limited as we are. Atheistic questions against Christianity remain. If good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, why do bad things happen to good people? And furthermore, why do Christians always want to tell everyone else what to do? These two questions are very much interconnected, and they sound a lot like what came out of Satan's mouth in the Garden of Eden when he convinced Adam and Eve to disobey God. He convinced them to believe that they knew better than God. In other words, they went their own way. Before I address the first question, why do bad things happen to good people, I want to return to the karmic element of God's commands. Good things happen when one does good, and bad things happen when one does bad. This is essentially a restating of the golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have done unto you. Or rather, what we say in modern times is, what goes around comes around. As we all know, according to Christianity, a good life is rewarded with heaven and a bad life is punished with hell. Atheist Sam Harris says, "Luckily, there is no proof of hell."
Now, happily, there's absolutely no evidence that the Christian hell exists.
For a man who claims to do his research, he really overlooked the evidence on this one. First, on the simplest and most metaphorical basis, heaven and hell are quite provable. And I'm quite sure that Harris would agree with the point I'm about to make, because the state and universities have sanctioned the acceptance of it. It's like what John Milton said, "The mind is its own place. It can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven," meaning it is how one thinks about his or her environment which determines the said reality of that place. Or like the old adage goes, perception is reality. But like everything else in modern science, we have an effect without understanding the cause. So where do our hellish or heavenly perceptions of reality come from? I will tell you. They are the result of our thoughts and actions. Good actions, which is to say those aligned with God and his commands, lead to peace of mind, i.e., a heavenly perception of reality. And bad actions, which are those that go against the will of God, lead to chaos and derangement of mind, i.e., a hellish perception of reality. Most of what I just said, outside of the God elements, Harris and other atheist scholars would accept. They would agree that perception is indeed reality, and how we think of the world has a definite impact on how we view it. This is not such a metaphysical notion. But the idea of an afterlife, that is, heaven and hell proper, is beyond the pale for people like Harris. Harris says there is no proof of hell. What about proof of heaven? Dr. Eben Alexander, one of the world's leading neurosurgeons, wrote the book on the subject. If one looks up the proof of heaven, however, one cannot help but be bombarded with all the criticism of Alexander and stories like his. The critics clearly have an atheistic, materialistic axe to grind. As a matter of fact, one criticism I found was from the Dalai Lama himself. He was clearly upset by just how convincing Alexander is at illustrating his afterlife experience, an experience that flies in the face of the Buddhist belief in reincarnation, saying, "A thorough investigation is required to ensure Alexander is reliable and has no reason to lie." The truth is, Dr. Alexander's story is just one of thousands like it. The sheer amount of near-death experiences, or NDEs as they have come to be known, is overwhelming. Scientists want to have it both ways. They will say these afterlife stories, even though they are remarkably similar to each other, as well as aligned with the biblical accounts of heaven and hell, and have been told by people from all different nations, backgrounds, and creeds, are scientifically inadmissible, because they are subjective experiences which cannot be applied to something as objective as science. If that were indeed true, then explain to me the use of case studies in the fields of psychology and medicine. Those too are merely subjective experiences, yet somehow we derive reliable meaning from them. The only real difference between NDEs and medical case studies is that the former has to do with God and religion, the very things the so-called rationalists loathe so deeply. If the rationalists want to talk about true objectivity, let us turn to the subject of mathematics. It must be asked here, who invented math? Don't worry if you don't know the answer. It's a trick question. Math was not invented, it was discovered. The only reason math could be discovered is because our world has intelligent design. And intelligent design means that there's an intelligent designer. In other words, we couldn't have math or any objective truths, which the rationalists venerate so deeply, without the existence of God. This brings us back to the beginning. Let me just say, thank God morality isn't subjective. Like I said before, we all know what's right and wrong. This can only be true if there is such a thing as objective morality. Coincidentally, this objective morality just so happens to align with the moral teachings found in the Bible. It is only when we admit that there is this objective moral truth that underlies the human experience that our society has any chance of existing in a state of peace and love, like the social justice warriors claim to be fighting for. The degeneracy, decadence, and overall moral poverty we have been seeing recently is the result of challenging God's authority at every turn and deliberately disobeying his commandments. This moral decay is so bad and so obvious that leading atheist Richard Dawkins has been lamenting as of late the degradation of the Christian cultural foundation upon which Western society has been built.
I do think that we are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer. But there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian. And so if we substituted any alternative religion, that would be truly dreadful.
So why do bad things happen to good people? The same reason they happen to bad people. It is because suffering is oftentimes what is needed to bring us closer to God. There is this old saying germane to our discussion, and that is, there are no atheists in foxholes. Simply stated, in moments of despair and desperation, we naturally reach out to God for help. When things are going well, on the other hand, it's easy to lose sight of God. The only thing that can keep the demons at bay, so to speak, is gratitude. Neuroscientists have proven that the same place in the brain where anxiety exists is the same place that gratitude exists, and the brain can only experience one of these emotions at a time. So if you are grateful, you quite literally have nothing to worry about. To stick with my earlier metaphor, the bad things in life occur as a way to redirect us at the proverbial fork in the road. That is, tough times are merely obstacles on our own path that form a detour to God's way. And to answer the second remaining atheist question, why do Christians always want to tell others what to do? A statement that is usually followed with, Christians are so judgmental, or I thought Christians were supposed to love their neighbor. I understand why a non-Christian might see things this way, but it's only because they are not seeing the bigger picture. True Christians aren't telling you what you should or shouldn't do in a controlling or judgmental way. They are doing so out of love, as harsh as they may come off at times. As I explained, we follow the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto you. As such, I would want someone to warn me of possible danger. Christians know that when you go against God's will, there will be hell to pay, as it were. So doesn't it make sense that it would be from a place of love and consideration that one would say, stop doing that bad thing that I know you know is bad? You unfortunately are listening to that inner voice that says you can't help it, or what you're doing isn't so bad. That inner voice is not your conscience speaking. It is Satan. It must be a Freudian slip that psychologists often refer to mental health struggles as fighting one's demons. They mean it, of course, as a common aphorism, just a figure of speech, and it should not be taken in any literal sense. Talk about missing the point entirely. If people don't start waking up to the immeasurable value that Christianity has brought to the Western world, how it underpins our language, our morality, our science, our history, and most of all, our society at large, in ways that we can never truly understand or calculate, then we will lose everything in some misguided attempt to replace the Christian religion with materialism, consumerism, and cultural diversity. Richard Dawkins is out here defending Christian culture while bashing Christian belief.
You said in a speech famously that I think a case can be made that faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate.
I do think that, yes. Because what I'm talking about there is faith, where faith means belief in something without evidence. Because if you believe something without evidence, then that justifies anything. You're no longer vulnerable to somebody coming back at you and saying, hang on a minute, let me argue the case. If you believe it without evidence, which is what faith is, then you don't argue the case. You say, no, I'm not arguing that case. This is my faith. It's mine. It's private. I don't dissent from it. I don't retreat from it. You're just going to have to accept it. Now, that is evil.
Sorry, sir. but you can't have it both ways. You either take the road to God or you follow your own path. You cannot do both. The final destination is not the same, and that's the whole point.
If you like this video, it would mean a lot to me if you would subscribe to my channel. That being said, I cannot take any credit for the things I create. I owe it all to God and His benevolent mercy and grace. Thank you, God. I love you.